Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us in our podcast as we go through the Well Bible Reading Journey. This is episode 8 of our Well Bible Reading Journey podcast, and I'm glad that you've joined us. This week, we're going to be going through Genesis chapters 22, 23, and 24 in the Old Testament, also Psalm chapter 8, and then Matthew chapter 8 in the New Testament. We've kind of moved out of the Sermon on the Mount and the Gospel of Matthew and are moving into all the things that Jesus is doing beyond that. So I'm glad you've joined us, and we're going to be talking today primarily focusing on Genesis chapter 22 and Psalm chapter 8. Genesis chapter 22 is huge. It is what is known as the binding of Isaac. It's that moment where God is testing Abraham and by asking him to sacrifice his son. This is a very big moment in the Genesis story and in the story of the patriarchs. So we're going to get right to it. I'm going to ask Amber and Craig to join us. Amber and Craig, thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here today. Yeah.
Hello.
We want to dive right in. There's a lot to cover today, especially in Genesis chapter 22. As I mentioned, this is a big moment in Jewish history, a big moment for Abraham. And it's actually quite controversial, isn't it? It's something that a lot of people have wrestled with throughout the years. The idea of God asking Abraham to sacrifice his own son, and of course there are a lot of comparisons to do here. So let's just start with you. And you've looked at this passage. What are some of the points of comparison and some of the things that popped out at you?
Yeah, thanks, Ellis. I really wrestled with this passage all week. We've seen our Jewish forebears and our Christian forefathers struggle with this for centuries. You pointed that out before, Ellis, and I felt that this week. I really struggled with the fundamental question we hear from atheists and agnostics across our country in our own day. How does a loving, all-purposeful, good God expect us and demand a child sacrifice? In some ways, the most heinous crime that we could think of. It kind of epitomizes barbarism for us in our civilized and enlightened mind. So what do we do with this? And there's several interpretational options that I came up with, not that I came up with, but that I found in my research that others have come up with.
Right.
Probably the first, which I found was interesting, was an ancient Hebrew early rabbinic midrash tradition that insisted that Abraham had misunderstood God. God was after Abraham to say, I asked you for a sacrifice, not for a slaughter. They imagine God saying, I never considered telling Abraham to slaughter Isaac, using the Hebrew root word letters for slaughter, not sacrifice. So there was a word in the original Hebrew that was kind of mixed up.
Right.
But from that perspective, around Abraham, child sacrifice was being practiced by all the other cultures because their gods demanded it. So the thinking is Abraham might have misheard because he was used to seeing that around him and just assumed that's what his God meant. But that's not what God meant at all. And so he provided a sacrifice in the end that we know in the place of, so that Abraham didn't go there because it was a misunderstanding. And that wasn't God's character.
Yeah. I think there's that movement from, as you said, it wasn't uncommon for child sacrifices to happen in the pagan cultures and the Canaanite culture. We see evidence of that. And some would see the rabbinical interpretation is that this moved Abraham out of that world of child sacrificing to animal sacrificing. And so they try to explain it that way. And in this interpretation that you're talking about, Craig, then the real theme of the story, the real emphasis in the story is that God is not that kind of God. He's not the kind of God that sacrifices children the way the other gods around him were demanding the child sacrifice. So you see that aspect to it. So what's the second kind of interpretation you looked at?
Yeah, so the second interpretation is one we're more familiar with in our Christian tradition, right? And it's the one that Hebrews calls out itself. The writer of Hebrews in chapter 11, verses 17 through 19 calls out this instance in particular and says that God was testing Abraham, and Abraham's obedience was such that his righteousness was counted to him. Yeah. And his obedience was such that he was so obedient, he was so firm in his faith in God that he knew God in some sense. He didn't know how, but he had faith that Isaac would be preserved, even if it was through resurrection.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of obedient faith that Abraham had. But that really amazes me because we know, of course, Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice, and we see through this Genesis 22 story that God provided the ram in the sacrifice in the case of Isaac and Abraham. But Abraham didn't know that. I think he knew the character and heart of God enough to have faith that God would provide somehow, and ultimately that's what uh, Abraham names this place, God will provide, on Mount Moriah, where this takes place in Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac. But ultimately, without Jesus and understanding that Jesus is a lens through which we as Christians, knowing history, can interpret this passage, we know that God is the God that doesn't demand us sacrifice our own children, that He will sacrifice His own child because His own child provides the righteousness that we are lacking, and eventually provides that sacrifice that we are not, and that we are incapable of.
Yeah, there's obvious analogies to and points of commonality between that scene and Jesus, but also to some degree chapter 12, isn't it? Because you have this with Abraham, the faith with God says get up and go, and he goes, and here at the beginning of the story he tells Abraham get up and go, and he goes, right? So there's some points of commonality looking back at Genesis 12 and the calling, and obviously looking forward. In some ways, the rabbis struggled with this tremendously, and in some ways you just will until Jesus comes along, and then it's like, oh, okay, that's what was going on, right? Amber, did you get some of that? What popped out at you?
Yeah, absolutely. The very first thing I noticed, Ellis, was what God said. I mean, that's the very first part of this chapter. So the first thing I noticed was what God said. He says to take, go, and offer, which sounded a lot like chapter 12, which you beat me to it, which is great. He says, take Isaac, go where I will show you, somewhere I'll be made seeable to you. There's that word again, and offer him. But honestly, what stuck out to me even stronger, the thing that I noticed even more, what wasn't said. Actually, I mean, Abraham, we know because we talked about it last week in our podcast for a long time. Abraham is not afraid to speak up and intercede with God, and to be bold in his, like, wait a second, like, with the Sodom story, like, hey, isn't there at least 50 righteous people? Would you save it? And then 30, and then 4, down it goes. And so obviously Abraham can speak up. He's not afraid to speak up. And so it's odd. It's almost fascinating how the author, and we're told that Abraham doesn't really say anything. We're not told what he thinks, says, feels. It just says his actions, and his actions speak a lot. His actions were he rose, he saddled, and then he took the 2 men with him and he cut the wood. So I guess I was left with the question, like, is this, what's going on here? Why isn't why isn't Abraham saying anything? Is it denial? Is it grief? Is it confidence? Is it cockiness? I don't really know, but it's fascinating. It brings some tension to the story.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a great insight that I've never really thought about. We just came off the Sodom and Gomorrah story, where Abraham is very bold, actually pleading for the lives of the Sodomites that he doesn't really know. It's just this town, right? His nephew Lot is there. So he's pleading for their lives, bartering with God. And then when it comes to his own son and God's saying, go sacrifice him, like, he doesn't say, okay, he doesn't barter with him, hey, what about if I just, don't kill him, just maybe, whatever. So yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I think that the story in general is really pointing again to Abram's faith, right? He responds in faith. And so it's, yeah. And as you said, very little dialogue, very little. It is a lot of movement, a lot of action. We just see what Abraham is doing, not necessarily what he's thinking or what he's asking.
And I love how all these actions we see speed up and slow down throughout this passage. I mean, at the very beginning of this passage, you have it's quick. He goes and he rises, and he goes and he looks for the mountain and he finds it. And it's like quick. And all of a sudden, starting in verse 9, I think, and through 14, this where right when he binds him and he lays him down and he's lifting up, it's like it slows way down. The story slows down. It brings this tension. It's almost like you're like, what's going to happen? And then all of a sudden, but God, but the angel speaks up. I just love how the story speeds up and slows down with actions.
Yeah, masterful storytellers. The
Yes.
biblical writers were absolutely masterful storytellers. They were professionals at it, and they knew how to build tension, how to release that tension, how to build that tension back up. You see the tension building when they're at the foot of the mountain, and Abram asks his servants to stay there, and he's taking Isaac up, and Isaac's saying, "Hey, we've got the wood. Where's the sacrifice?" Right? And Abraham is telling him, "Don't worry about it. God will provide. God will provide." That interesting that the name also Ra is that God sees. Right? Like here we have that again. We have. We've got a high place. What else do we have here, Amber, that you like to look for?
Oh yeah, exactly right. Speaking of the ingeniouses of these biblical authors, right? Here's another one. They follow these themes, and I've since podcast 1, I have been saying there's going to be these moments of testing on high places near trees. I've been saying this since the beginning.
Yeah.
And here's another one. And I think the testing part's obvious. We've already said multiple times, this is a story of being tested. So I think that one's the obvious one. Abraham's being tested. Is he going to follow through? Is he going to obey God? What's going to happen?
Right.
But the other two are a little more sneaky. So let's dig in. Verses 2 and 3 will have the other two parts of this. Verses 2, Ellis, you already mentioned, it talks about to the high place I will show you, to the mountain I will show you. I will be made seeable to you. That's the high place. And then the other one is even more tricky. It says he cuts wood, and this word for wood is actually ates, and that's the same word we've been seeing this whole time for all the trees. In Hebrew, the word ates is tree. It can also be wood. It can also be vine. It can also be shrub. It could be lots of these words. Basically, anything that's wooden and grows and it's taller than your ankles, I'm pretty sure is the word ates.
Yeah.
And so here you go. It's a little tricky. You have to dig in, but here you go. He has the ates. Not only that, guys, but no, he's carrying this ates on his back, and that just it just gets me chills about it.
Yeah, so he's carrying the tree up the mountain with him.
I know,
to this high place and this sacred place. The tree's there with them. And he's carrying the tree on his back. So yeah, I mean, how can you miss that?
Definitely a testing in a high place near a tree, but it promise you it won't be the last.
That's right.
But again, I'll just call this out. We have Jesus as the interpretative key as Christians. We see Jesus carried the tree up the mountain on his back in his sacrifice. And it's almost, we get to the point where we have high place, tree, testing, sacrifice throughout the Bible, to your point, Amber, but it's never quite enough to make up for the fall that we saw in Genesis 3 until we get to Jesus' sacrifice.
You're exactly right. We kind of talked.
Yeah,
you're exactly right. We kind of talked about this before we started, but yeah, you're exactly right. Where we see the first tree of testing is the fall story, and you keep seeing these moments of like a chance for them to redeem it, and it's just not quite enough. We keep failing over and over again. So until Jesus. So thank you for pointing that out. It's good.
Yeah, it's great. And as I said, this is a story that is so hard to understand. There's so much tension in it. We do ask the question, and it's a fair question. How can God ask Abraham to kill his son? How can he ask for this child sacrifice? And the rabbinical interpretation notwithstanding, we don't really go with that one, that Abraham misunderstood him. No, I mean, God was asking him to do something. So then the point then becomes not so much that God calls for sacrifice. The point becomes that God provides. So there's this sense of testing, but also provision. Testing, but also provision. This idea that God will never test you to the point where without providing, right, a way through the testing, a way through the difficulty. And so God is testing, but he's going to provide. And Luther, for instance, hated this story. Luther could not stand this story. I mean, he just really wrestled and struggled with this story. But he finally ended up on the idea that Abraham knew that God could do something with what was coming. So Luther puts it this way, that Abraham believed that God could raise Isaac from the ashes if he wanted to, right? So there is this confidence, this interesting confidence we see in Abraham, even as he's going up. Don't worry, God's going to provide. What is it? Does he tells the servants, we'll be back, right?
Yeah, exactly. It says that he says, okay, guys, stay here. we are going to go over there, me and the boy.
Yeah.
We're going to go over there. We are going to worship together and we will return. It doesn't say I will return. And
Yeah.
so my first thought was like, well, is he like having the sly? Like he's like, don't be sneaky, or is it just real confidence that God will provide? And it does say, Abraham does say, he says that God will provide himself a lamb for this burnt offering. And this word provide, it can also be translated as will see to it. He will see to it. It's like a real confident, he will see to it.
Yeah, it's the idea of seeing. It's the same thing with Hagar, right? Where she's this the God who sees, and the God who sees always means he sees you. He's going to provide. He's
And
going to provide.
what about that confidence in Isaac to also follow and obey? Talk about that.
Yeah, we don't know exactly how old Isaac was, but he was older. He was old enough to carry wood on his back. He was probably a teenager, an older teenager at this point. And so, yes, he could have run away. He could have rebelled as most teenagers would against their father. You almost see a little Abraham and Isaac, right? This little kind of obedient. He crawls up onto the altar. His father binds him. He doesn't. There's no indication he's fighting back. It's this kind of interesting, quiet faith that believes God is going to do something with my situation. And that's really so encouraging to me. Should be so encouraging to us today. We can go into any situation knowing that God is going to do something with my situation, no matter how dark it seems, right?
Yeah, my mama heart is like, I want to hear and feel all the emotions that's happening in this passage, and it doesn't give it to you. So you almost have to create it for yourself. Like what, this moment of tension, like he's literally raising this knife in the air. And what's interesting is this knife actually has a funny word that actually means it's kind of meant for the word to eat, which is interesting. It's like to eat flesh, and it's like this whole scene is being built. And as my mama heart's like, oh my gosh, no.
Yeah.
And of course God provides. And I just it's a passage to struggle with, but it's also a passage of awe because we get to look backwards, like Craig was saying earlier, because we know the whole story. We can look back and be like, oh, okay, this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great to have Jesus and to be able to see it through the prism of Jesus, which is
Right.
the way, by the way, you guys out there, that's the way we should be always interpreting the Old Testament is through the lens of Jesus. And so it just opens this up to so much more. And it's kind of this aha moment. But to your point, Amber, he's asked Abraham to sacrifice the child of promise. I mean, he's been waiting for Isaac, right? God promised this, and he promised the descendants. And now is God going to take that back? Is God going to take back his promise? And Abraham seems extremely confident, right? That God's not going to do that. That's not the way God works.
And that's the essence of our faith. And when we talk about covenant faithfulness, which we talked about last week or week before, this is the sense that we do have. That is exactly our confidence that our faith in God is that He will be faithful to His promises, and that when He says something, He's going to follow through with it because He's God and that's who He is.
Right, and that's not easy to do in the middle of it, right? It's not easy to do, especially when you have something that maybe God has been promising you for a long time, and now He gives it to you, and then so I think what He wants to know, and this is part of what may be happening here is that this is the long-awaited child, the child of the promise, the child of my future. All hope is riding on him, right? No pressure for poor Isaac, right? It's all riding on him. And so God wants to know, so now have you made an idol out of the thing I've given you, right? The thing is your faith, your trust, and now in Isaac, or is it in me, right? And that's very easy to happen where it's something you've wanted for so long. It seems the answer to all your problems, and you get it. Now you don't want to let it go, right? And God is saying, are you going to depend on Isaac, or are you going to depend now on me? It's easy in our day and world too, as parents live vicariously through their children oftentimes, right? Even something as wonderful as our children can be idolized. And we've got to be very careful with that. And so Abraham shows that no, his trust is still in God. Which maybe is a good segue to Psalm chapter 8. Psalm chapter 8, we wanted to talk a little bit about that. And it's a beautiful psalm. Obviously, it's a very famous psalm. And it's really interesting. If you take the psalm contextually, it really throws a lot of light on what God is doing. Amber, you looked a little bit at that, the context of Psalm chapter 8. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. The way my brain works is I have to understand what's going on in the whole outlook before I can understand what the psalm is about, especially the psalms.
Yeah.
They're very feely, and I'm not as feely, so I need to know all the information.
They are touchy
So
feely.
exactly. So what I found is most people might know is that there's 150 psalms, but they are broken up usually in 5 parts, most of the time called books. So you have 5 books of the Psalms. In our passage today, it actually falls in book number 1. And then in book number 1 also is split up in 5 parts. And you have the first part, which is just basically the first 2 chapters of Psalms, where it's just the introduction to what's happening, what's going on in this book. You have talk about the anointed one and kind of talk about the Messiah and all the things like that. And then you have the second part in chapter 8, right here, what we're talking about today, is right smack in the middle of part 2. And anytime something's right in the middle, it's really important you need to pay attention to it.
That's right.
And so that's when I started paying attention to it. So I looked what was before and after, and then maybe Ellis and Craig, you guys can help me figure out what's right here in the middle. But what's happening before is chapters 3 through 7, and you have reflections. This is what we've been reading this far. You all know what we're talking about. It's the reflections of David, his past, and when he feels powerless and he had to flee from his enemies. And these are poems of David crying out for deliverance and asking God to help to restore him back to king. So you have these powerful moments of powerlessness and things like that. And then you have chapter 8, which we'll talk about. And then the remainder of this part 2 is chapters 9 through 14. And these are about, David is joined by a group of people that they call the poor and afflicted ones. And like David, they have been oppressed by these rulers and they're crying out to God to be vindicated. And these afflicted people and David are the very ones that God has chosen to partner and co-rule his world with. Yep. And then here we go, right here in chapter 8 to help us understand it.
It's a pivot moment. Yeah, it's very much a pivot moment to what you're saying with the context. It's a hinge for that first book, as you're mentioning. And the poor in spirit, back to Jesus and his Sermon on the Mount, which we've just been through. Blessed are the poor in spirit, and many believe it's an allusion to this, that they're the ones that God goes to, the least of these. David himself was the runt of the litter. He was the youngest. He was the smallest. He was just put him out there with the sheep. And so, but here God is working through that. That's awesome. So, Craig, what kind of popped out at you with Psalm chapter 8?
Yeah, really. So thanks for that context of where Psalm 8 is sitting within the Psalms, Amber. I think that's really important and really enlightening for me, because I just concentrated more on Psalm 8 itself, and what you brought to light, Amber, makes a lot more sense of even what I was seeing. So what I saw within Psalm 8 itself was the structure of, you got bookends of God's sovereignty in the first couple verses and the last verse of Psalm 8. God is sovereign, he's the ruler. Within that, those verses, within the middle, we have almost a reflection and some questions on what is man, and some tentative answers, some tentative exploration of what our place in the universe might be based on what God has revealed. And so from that sense, the question, what is man? The sense of, ultimately can only be answered within Jesus. Again, interpreting the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus, he is the last Adam, the true man that fulfilled not only Israel's vocation, but all of mankind's, humanity's calling to be faithful to God, and with the righteous, rightful walking with God. And so there's that. Secondly, there's this sense of where we are within the creation. We are called co-rulers with God. And, he lays out the fact that within his creation, we are helping God rule. And that's just, one, it's very humbling, but two, it's just very awe-inspiring that man who is, in one sense, what is man that God would think of him? But in the other sense, he thinks so much of us, even though we sin and turn our back on him, that he's going to make us co-rulers. So what does it look like for us to be co-rulers? If we take our co-rulership, our co-sovereigntyship for the universe outside of God's ultimate sovereignty, we don't have dominion anymore. We don't have biblical dominion. We have domination. We have domination over nature. We have domination over the earth. We have domination over ourselves and what our lives, what God has called us to. And not only is that sin, but it's the way of death. And And it's interesting, you talking about, again, Amber, you talking about trees and high places and tests earlier. I can't help but wonder, some commentators have called Psalm 8 a nature psalm, the nature psalm.
Hmm.
Is this a bigger illusion of trees and testing for humankind, in the sense of, while the text doesn't say this, I'm projecting this maybe a little bit based on your influences, but from the sense of, if trees are placed at places of testing, and if mankind is not ruling well, not co-ruling well, and is in a sense of domination, we need to ask ourselves, are we good ecological stewards of the earth? Are we taking our ecological responsibilities to heart? If we're cutting down forests and denuding the planet, are we really moving closer to God and our call, or further away? The more we embrace industrialization and smokestacks and machines, how are we really carrying ourselves more towards our humanity, or more towards a dehumanized caricature of ourselves? Just
Oh,
questions to ponder.
no, that's good. That's great. Great application. It's this sense of, and I love what you did with the idea of co-rulership with God, where God has commanded, for at the beginning, for the man and the woman, for humanity to care for the earth, right? To rule over it. But there's a difference, as you've said. I love that difference between ruling and dominating, right? This ruling and dominating, and where the ruler, as Jesus would say, but I think God says it too, is the servant of the one, right? Is there to serve, not to exploit, or to
Great point.
use, or to abuse. And so it's the exploitation of that which we've been given that takes us really outside of the will of God, and we're no longer ruling under God's will. And anytime, whether you're talking about ruling the earth and taking care of nature and so forth, or ruling over people, anytime we do that outside of the will of God, it becomes an abusive situation. It becomes domination, and not leadership, or not caring for, right? You see the same thing happen with the relationship between Adam and Eve in the garden, where this consequence of their sin was, part of it was, he said, she will want to she will want, her desire will be to rule over you, but you will rule over her. There becomes this battle now over domination, right? As opposed to this loving beforehand, before the fall, this kind of loving relationship where they were just like interdependent, right? And so they were one flesh. Now they're fighting. And so you have this in Psalm chapter 8. That's really, really great. There is this idea in Psalm chapter 8 about all of nature. So when you see nature, right, it gives you this sense of being so small, right? Well, what is man that you're mindful of him, right? So there's this sense of being so small, so small. And I think, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 1 that we're without excuse. You could just look out in the world and recognize there has to be a God, right? So when we look at nature, there is this sense of there being a God, and me being so small in that. But I'm not sure there's necessarily a real answer, a real hope that comes with Jesus, right? Jesus fulfills Psalms chapter 8 in that, in the sense that Jesus is the one who gives us hope. Did you see some of that, Amber? What else did you see? Any other questions out of Psalm chapter 8?
I have something that came to my mind as you were talking, and then I had something I wrote down as Craig was talking, if you don't mind.
No, go for it.
So first thing is, when you were talking about creation and Adam and Eve, it dawned on me that when God created, he created birds in the sea and all the things, and he says to be fruitful and multiply, meaning God's blessing allows those to be fruitful and to reproduce, right? To reproduce on their own. So the birds and the creatures and this, everything can do it on their own. And then the trees, right? The fruit trees, all the things, they're also reproducible. They have God's blessing on them. They can reproduce. They are full of the fruit in this blessing. And then we are the same. We are no different than them. We are full of God's blessing, meaning we can be fruitful and multiply. We can regenerate. We're no different than. So why choose us? I just think it hit me just now how incredibly beautiful it is that we all have the same blessing of God, this fruitful and multiply and being able to regenerate on our own. They don't need us. The trees can do it on our own, right? The creatures can do it on their own, but yet he asks us to co-rule with him. And that is, and he made us to be like him so we can do that well under his being dependent upon him to do that well.
Right.
So saying that to be dependent upon him to do that well, that reminds me of what I wrote down. Craig, as you were talking, I wrote down, I summarized what I think I hear. Can I write it? Can I read it?
Yeah.
Psalms 8 describes Yahweh as the king of creation who made dependent humans as his royal partners. This is unexpected and wonderful news to those who understand the need of God, but it is offensive to those who want to rule their lives apart from Yahweh.
Oh, good. That's excellent.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
That's right. Yeah, that is right on. This is also Psalm 8 is considered sometimes a messianic psalm because you have the mention of the Son of Man. Verse 4, who is man that you're mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him. And that's a generic term, but it's also a term that Jesus took on for himself. His favorite term, his favorite title for himself was Son of Man. Part of it was a little nebulous, and it's from Daniel and from other places, obviously from the Psalms. So you have here this sense, even here in Psalm 8, a little bit of Jesus, where we are co-heirs, co-rulers with God and with Jesus, who was the Word from the beginning, right? And he's in this one as well as we look through Psalm 8. Okay, great. Anything else from Psalm 8? Anything else from Genesis chapter 22 before we wrap up?
Yeah, I have one quick thing, and this is less about Psalms 8 and more just for the listeners for something they can hold on to as they study themselves. Craig pointed out that in Psalms 8, it starts and ends with the same verse. It starts and ends with the same phrases. And that is something that's called inclusio. And that's a really important clue. So when you're reading, and it's something that maybe we don't discuss on this podcast, when you're reading and you notice that the thing at the beginning, thing at the end is bookmarked with this inclusio, it is a signal to you, it's a signal as a reader that this poem is all about that thing. And everything in the middle either explains or supports those initial statements. And so just something to hold on to as you further read into the Psalms, because you're going to see this more and more.
Yeah, no, the Old Testament writers especially used a lot of inclusio. You want to think about it as bookends, right? That are holding everything in there together, and so those bookends are the same. They look the same, they sound the same, and you're absolutely right, Amber. Everything that's in between them is revealing and has to be interpreted through those bookends. That's holding it all together. Very good, very good. Craig, did you have anything?
I know it's just, I find it interesting. Kind of, we hit some real tension in our story in Genesis 22 this week. Y'all both pointed that out.
Mm-hmm.
Genesis 23, we see Sarah pass away and Abraham mourns her. This is the first act of mourning at death we see in the scripture. Genesis 24, we see the story of Rebekah being found by Abraham's servant and brought back to Isaac for marriage to Isaac. And just the detail of those stories become more and more human, if you will, in the sense of almost a novella that we would recognize today. So to y'all's point that you've already made, the Old Testament writers knew how to tell stories, and we're going to see a lot of them coming up. So stay tuned.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Thanks for summarizing that for us, Craig, because that's an important point. Sometimes we get into the weeds, and that's good. We like to get into the details. But every once in a while, take a step back and remember that this is part of a larger story. And Abraham is just the beginning of that larger story. And so what we are into, guys, is the full-fledged patriarchal narratives. They're going to take us all the way through the end of Genesis, all the way through the 12 tribes, and as they go to Egypt. But this is their story, and it's the story of the beginnings, the foundations of what will be known as Judaism, and will eventually give birth to Messiah, Jesus, and Christianity, right? So it's good to get that bigger picture. This is the journey we're on, and we're just starting that journey. We're going to see a lot more high places, a lot more trees, a lot more moments of testing, a lot of what I love about the Bible is it doesn't clean things up. It doesn't erase the bad things that happens. It reports them, and these people that God used are not perfect. It reports all their failures, the times they didn't do right, but gives us hope, right? Gives us hope, and it's all pointing back to Jesus. So we want you to keep that in mind this week as you read the scriptures, as you wrestle with Genesis chapter 22. We'd love to hear your thoughts, but be sure and put them in the comment section down below. You may have another perspective, another angle, and that's perfectly fine. We would love to hear what God is saying to you through his word this week. So put it in the comment section, and we'll be glad to hear from you. So guys, thanks again for being a part of it this week. We look forward to coming back to you next week. Until then, I pray that God blesses you as you read his word every day. God bless you.
Bye-bye.